it's going to more or less allow the ruling elite to do as they wish. And this has been a long-term aspiration of many, both on the libertarian right and on the autocratic right. You mentioned people like Peter Thiel, right? He's floated ideas of basically creating miniature cities governed by people like him, of course, out on the oceans, beyond the purview of government. And there'll be no welfare. There'll be no kind of succor offered to ordinary people. There'll definitely be no regulations on what it is that he wants to do. And this flows from a worldview that is centrally committed to the idea that, as Yarvin put it once, the masses suck, and everything that they have, they owe to those who are better than them.
Level low.
Hi guys, welcome to Bullhorn Bulletin, and I'm Zeynab. Today I will be talking to Matt McManus. And Matt is the author and co-author of Against Political Liberal Courts and Justice, Rescuing Ronald Dworkin's Legacy, The Political Right and Equality, and Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, amongst other books. And tell us a little bit about where you work, Matt, and we'll get into what we're talking about today.
Sure. Well, first off, thanks a lot for having me here. Right now, I'm a lecturer in political science at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. My wife and I live in Detroit, go Lions. I write a lot about the political right, liberal socialism, contemporary politics, a little bit all around the world, that kind of thing.
Great. Awesome. And that's why it's so critical. You were one of the first people that I ever saw cover Curtis Yarvin. And I know that you had written an article for the Commonwealth Magazine about that was entitled Curtis Yarvin's Case Against Democracy. Curtis Yarvin is Too Elitist for Fascism. And for anyone kind of wondering who Curtis Yarvin is a guy that is intertwined with Peter Thiel. He's sort of in the background of the tech bros, but his philosophy is a lot of what we're seeing unfold right now within the Trump administration. Some of the key things that J.D. Vance, Peter Thiel, and even Trump's executive orders are rolling out are tied to, I guess, what you could call Yarvin doctrine. And Yarvin argues for some crazy things such as monarchy and authoritarianism. And he doesn't even cloak it in any kind of, I guess he doesn't hide it in any kind of way. He doesn't cloak it whatsoever. He's just out front about this. There's no mystique behind it. He says what he means. A lot of it is painfully stupid, as we'll get into. But I guess one of the first questions I would have for you is tell us a little bit about, and I know I gave a little brief introduction of who this guy, Curtis Yarvin, is, but if you could fill us in a little bit on what got you involved in sort of writing about it, how you stumbled across this guy, because you wrote this article back in 2023. It's a little while ago. Regarding Mencius Molebug, and that was sort of his like Reddit persona. So tell us a little bit about him.
Sure. Well, Curtis Yarvin, aka Mencius Molebug, aka a bunch of other pseudonyms, if you're really interested, really came to the fore in the late 2000s, around the time when Barack Obama was elected. And here's important to provide a little bit of context. A lot of people on the right, including the libertarian right, were profoundly disturbed by Obama's election, including Peter Thiel, who you mentioned before. And Thiel has a very close relationship with Yarvin, and he's widely speculated to have funded Yarvin's lifestyle for quite a long period of time. So in the 2000s, Thiel wrote an article, The Education of a Libertarian, essentially arguing that he realized post-Obama that democracy just does not work. The reason being, especially since the suffrage of women, people in democracies are just far too prone to not cherishing property rights, especially the property rights of the rich, the way that they're supposed to. And they're invariably going to be pushed towards wanting to expand the state to provide themselves with various different kind of welfare programs. And so the only libertarian thing to do is to adopt this much more reserved, cautious, even hostile attitude towards democracy. Until it's been banging that drum in one way or another ever since. But Yarvin, as you point out, goes even further. So in his initial podcast under the pseudonym Mencius Moldbug, he propagated outright reactionary and monarchist thought, called himself a Carlylean, a follower of the 19th century hyper-conservative philosopher Thomas Carlyle. And essentially what he argued, drawing upon different libertarian strands of thought as well, particularly Murray Rothbard and anarcho-libertarianism, is that democracy invariably has this tendency to move towards a kind of totalitarianism. And this can seem very strange to us, but essentially he argues, look, as you know, the state grows to try to manage the interests of the mediocre. Invariably, it takes more and more control over people's lives, particularly the lives of the most excellent kinds of figures in society. And this leads to disorder, chaos, entropy. You choose your synonym, right? And so he argued that the best thing for us to do is to appoint something that looks a lot like a CEO in chief. Back in the day, his favorite CEO in chief would be somebody like Steve Jobs, the paradigmatically associated with Apple. Since then, he's kind of gotten on the Elon Musk train. But, the argument that he used then is very similar to the argument he uses today, which is to say, think about all the wonderful things in your life, whether you're thinking about Teslas or iPads or iPhones or whatever happens to be. They were made in a monarchy because they were made by a corporation that's governed by a CEO in chief that has almost absolute power. And if that model works there, why shouldn't it work extended pretty much to the whole of society? And that's him, I should also add, at his most sober-minded and most generous in terms of interlocuting with others. And let's call it more droll moods. He'll say things like, I'm Hitler, but with a few more IQ points, or the Axis powers in the Second World War were kind of like the rebellion in Star Wars, fighting against the evil empire of liberalism and communism, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm giving you is the politically correct, whitewash, woke version of Curtis Yarvin. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, there's a lot of almost what I would call Gilead, sort of dystopian. He wraps up every demagogic dystopia that you can imagine from every 80s film you ever watched into his theory of change. And his theory of change, from what I have found, is you run the government like a corporation. And in order to do that, you have to have an extreme amount of control. The presidency would be treated like a kingship, and there would be an erosion of powers. I have one clip, and I'm going to go ahead and play it because I think that it sort of encapsulates this idea, and it's him talking to Charlie Kirk, I believe, very recently about his viewpoints on. He feels that the checks and balances are overreach, that the only true democratic representation of the people is the presidency, which is asinine if you think about it, because every member of Congress is elected. We can talk all day about dark money influencing elections, but that's not a concern of his. That's not a concern. He doesn't support open democracy. Let's take a listen really quick.
So, in order to remedy this sort of great imbalance, or this usurpation of the legislative and judicial branches over the executive branch, which has become the democratic branch with a small d, and thus has been rendered utterly toothless in the sense that the president himself has power over the government. The only remedy for this wrong is to put the president entirely in charge of the government. And that essentially means that the executive branch, far from being checked and balanced in a way that does not work and has left the executive branch not checked and balanced, but simply hogtied and held hostage, is to render the executive branch completely unilateral.
So to end executive overreach, you have to eliminate checks and balances. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is theme that's become very popular in far-right circles recently, although it goes way, way back for reasons that I'll explain. So Yarvin has variable feelings, let's call it that way, about not democracy, which he's been uniformly hostile to, but making appeals to kind of populist rhetoric. At various points, he famously has argued that people need to take the red pill and wake up to the fact that a liberal, egalitarian, feminist cathedral has basically gripped the thoughts of everybody and controls and manages dissent. And the only way to kind of counteract that is by mobilizing different kind of popular forces to confront this. And he's harped on that theme to the present day, right, where he argues for an alliance between what he calls dark elves and hobbits, basically an intellectual elite and ordinary people. And you might see this as having, again, as he calls it, a kind of small d democratic character. But he's very, very overt about what comes at the end of this. So I mentioned the kind of dark elf alliance with the hobbits. He says at the end of this process, the hobbits go home and the dark elves take over. And the reason for this is that the hobbits, or the masses, suck generally. They can be used by the dark elves in order to tame power for the good of the hobbits, but that's kind of the end of it. But if you want to put it in a more sophisticated idiom, a lot of these ideas go back to, well, really to 18th century thought, but in the more modern form to the thinking of Carl Schmitt, who was a very important Nazi jurist who's had an enormous impact on the far right. So Schmitt became extremely popular in Weimar Germany in the 1920s and the 1930s for his argument that liberal democracy and the checks on the sovereign was essentially a sham. The reason being that liberal democracy invariably descended into at best, a kind of endless discussion about what we should do that can never be resolved because liberals were always insistent upon tolerating any kind of dissent rather than taking action. Or liberals didn't actually mean that they wanted to tolerate everybody else. What they meant was that everybody wanted to be a liberal, so then they would use the strong arm of the state in order to impose their own political theological worldview on others. And Schmitt's argument was, rather than have that, let's just appoint a dictatorial figure. Like Mussolini or like Hitler. And this dictatorial figure, if he has no checks on his power, might actually be more democratic in some senses than a liberal democracy, because imposing checks on the will of the people as embodied in the dictator seemed from his standpoint to be inherently undemocratic. Why shouldn't the leader who represents the will of the people, the true will of the people, be able to do whatever is necessary to pursue the good of the people as he understands it? And this, of course, is a striking template in Nazi thought. Hitler himself, used to say something very similar when he argued for the leadership principle, arguing what is right is what is good for the German people. And of course, the great genius who leads history, namely himself, knows what is right for the German people and consequently what is good. So there's kind of a lot of different themes that are very popular on the far right that are kind of working its way into those statements. But also, let's just get real, right? Right now, right-wing populism is in vogue. Yarvin's a pretty slick guy in some ways, and I think it just recognizes that's important to at least gesture towards the importance of the people if you're going to argue for the subordination of the people and you want to get them to get behind that.
Yeah, and essentially, even when we talk about Schmitt, what we were looking at then, even within Nazi Germany, even within what we were seeing today, is a minority rule.
Oh, yes.
We're authoritarian, but also minority with the wider population. You fix an election, you get your CEO or your person in there, and then, corporations and whatever kind of tyrants get to run roughshod. Mm-hmm. And those are the people that are essentially really supposed to represent everyone, because the general population, the proletariat, are, idiots. In their view, are uneducated masses, which it's so ironic because, you spoke about the cathedral, and I want to circle back to that for just a second, because, Yarvin describes a cathedral as sort of an amalgamy of universities and the mainstream press. And so he has this idea that because the press doesn't allow you to say the N-word, for instance, because there's censorship on that's tyranny. But at the same time, this man wants to institute intellectual and control over all press, media, over everything. And he also talks about being anti-institutional, but at the same time, he says that the people that should be in charge are the billionaires and the Ivy League and the educated elite. I feel like he's a walking contradiction. And I was wondering if you had any comments on that.
Well, I have a few, right? I mean, without a doubt, what you're saying is true. And this is a recurring feature of far-right discourse going, again, all the way back to the 1920s, or even further back, really, where they are quite cognizant of the fact that basic liberal rights, democracy is broadly popular with ordinary people. And confronting it directly, except in some instances, is a pretty dangerous thing to do because you risk marginalizing yourself. And so what a lot of far-right movements will do is appropriate the language of democracy for themselves and then accuse liberals, progressive feminists of actually being the ones who are not adequately beholden to this. Schmidt is a perfect example of that, right? He was smart enough to realize that one way to actually make Nazism, which was fundamentally an undemocratic movement, popular, was by saying, well, no, actually a dictator with unchecked power, if he represents the will of the vote, is actually more democratic than this endless talk shop that you see characteristic of liberal democracy. And, you know, liberal democracy is not really all that democratic anyway, because a lot of times liberals will silence people who hold views that are contrary to them. There's no sense of kind of gradations of freedom available in any of this thinking. And Yarvin is very similar, right? In the effort to try to repackage an argument for the people subordinating themselves to ordinary people to make it seem palatable. But I also think that part of this does go deeper, right, than just kind of cannily saying what you need to in order to get elected. Like baked into their worldview is the idea of being a dispossessed group. It's very strongly characteristic of reactionary thought. A lot of people aren't sure why it is that these people constantly claim to be victims. Well, because they really perceive themselves to be victims, right? Their view is that there but for all, the feminists, the den mothers, the longhouse, the cathedral, whatever it happens to be, we would really be the rulers of this society, and everyone would be better off since we're the natural aristocracy that deserves to be in charge, right? And the fact that we've been dispossessed by that, of this by all these progressive forces is a reason to feel resentment, victimization, and consequently we are entitled to do unto them as they perceive as having been done to them. They say we deserve to do unto them what they've done unto us. From their perception, at the very least, and that gives a kind of emotional resonance to a lot of these arguments and soft sells a lot of the hypocrisy that they'll otherwise indulge in.
Yeah, they view oppression as any kind of checks on the oppression that they wish to do unto others. It's oppression of them if they, you know, support RFK Jr. wanting to put people with ADHD in camps. You know, if you're oppressing, you know, our choice to, you know, send people without due process to an El Salvadorian prison with unlimited checks and balances and no trial, where they stay indefinitely in a slave labor camp. It's insane, but that is where we are. And that reminds me, I do have two more very, very short clips, and I'll play those, and those would be the last of the clips that I'll play. But it does encompass sort of where Yarvin is on this, so that folks can get even kind of more of an idea as to what we're talking about before we kind of head into your descriptions of him in your article, but then also how that relates to what is happening right now. Because you wrote this article in 2022. I was following it loosely back then as well. I did not anticipate. I was worried as soon as Vance got into office. I was like, no. But I did not anticipate it escalating this quickly and this fast under this current administration. I know people had their eyes on Project 2025, but I don't think that a lot of people realize. I think they're just now starting to, but a lot of people haven't been honed into this whole Techno Monarchy, Yarvin, you know, Peter Thiel sort of Andreessen network of oligarchs that we have really running everything. So we'll take a listen really here to what J.D. Vance has to say, and then what Yarvin sort of said to Cenk Uygur on TYT a couple years ago. So this clip from J.D. Vance was recent. It was just a couple weeks ago, but then I want you to hear what he had to say, what Yarvin had to say 2 years ago to Cenk Uygur.
How do we, aside from elections, how do we rip out this leadership class? So these institutions are corrupted and rotted to the core. This elite ideology is everywhere and in all the things. What other options do we have besides voting them out, which we're seeing is ineffectual?
Yeah. So again, this is like a tough question, but this is maybe the question that confronts us right now. You know, there's this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who's written about some of these things.
You need a CEO, and a national CEO is what's called a dictator. It's the same thing. There's no difference between a CEO and a dictator. If Americans want
Oh, I apologize. I thought that Vance interview was more recent, but apparently that was from 2021. So JD Vance has been following this guy for years. We'll take a listen to what he had to say on Jank's show, probably shortly after this interview with JD Vance that took place.
What we need is to basically have a CEO there. And what we're going to trust is that whoever wins the election is whoever has the confidence of the people to be the CEO of Washington. And by the way, if you read the Constitution, you know, the Constitution is actually totally more than tolerant of this form of government. It says right there that the president is the chief executive of the executive branch. And yet, you know, as we use the word, and they meant the word chief executive as we use it in the private sector, and the president doesn't matter if he's a Republican or a Democrat, he doesn't have 1/1000th of a control of the so-called executive branch that a private sector CEO has.
Okay, but
it's really
Curtis,
controlled by Congress. And so what you're basically saying is, I'm saying, okay, you know, make sure you have a system where the people still evaluate the president's work every 4 years, make him accountable to the voters, and just put him in charge of the goddamn government.
Isn't that a democracy? I thought you were arguing against it.
Yeah, it is. It's a democracy in which democracy puts forward a monarch rather than putting forward policies. And most people think of a democracy in terms of voting on policies.
I understand. But in those 4 years then, if he is truly a monarch and he's unaccountable, again, he could execute anyone he likes. He could end the elections. He could do anything he wants.
He sure could. And so what you really, he sure could. And of course, ending the elections is, you know, I mean, the Supreme Court could end elections tomorrow, right? They have the same level of absolute power. Granted, they're 9 people rather than 1, but they have been acting a little erratic lately. They could cancel the election. They could say, hey, Donald Trump is still president, right? They have that sovereignty, and he, you know, they could have pinned down that decision and he could walk into the frickin' White House. That is not going to happen. And so what you're looking at when you look at a monarchy is you're looking at a situation in which essentially the goals of the monarch are aligned with the goals of the public. And do you have to be lucky in picking that first monarch? To some extent, you do.
You gotta get lucky. That's your best.
Get it right.
Okay, so I'm being serious.
Sorry,
really, you think yes. Your best plan is, let's hope we pick the right.
Better hope they made the right choice.
Yeah, it doesn't look like they did. But coming back to what he said there, considering it was a while before this current election, what are some of the things that you see coming down the pike right now that are reminiscent of, you know, the old Mencius Mollbug writings or, you know, Yarvin's dogma?
Well, there are a couple of different examples, right? One is the relentless attacks on the media and pretty much any countercultural source of resistance, right? So Yarvin's project was a lot bigger than just replacing the person who's at the head of the government with somebody who's more to his liking. That was absolutely vital, and giving them the power to enact a sweeping agenda was absolutely vital. But was challenging the hegemony, if you want to call it that, of what he takes to be the kind of progressive worldview. So here we need to kind of go back in time a little bit. Yarvin, in his early writings, characterized himself as a Carlylean. You should say that I'll always be a Carlylean the same way that a Marxist will always be a Marxist. And what he means by that is somebody who is just deeply, deeply, deeply hostile to the advent of egalitarian modernity. The idea that ordinary men and women should have a say in how they're governed and more or less have a say in how their own lives go without being interfered with by others, right? He argues actually that he's so reactionary in opposition to this kind of democratic egalitarian ethos that he's not even angry about the French Revolution. He's still angry about the English Civil War. So think about that. Used to characterize the American Revolution as a travesty, a bunch of traitors who overthrew their legitimately elected government, all of which was, is probably closer to his sincere worldview. But it seems to me that he's kind of realized that being overt about that, certainly to a more mainstream audience, isn't exactly going to be an easy sell. So you got to kind of candy coat some of this in a sweeter, more democratic sounding language. But the goal is ultimately the same, right? To overturn this egalitarian, liberal, democratic culture that he associates with the cathedral, that he thinks has been predominant now for about 200 years, with a reactionary culture where people will just become okay and even think it is natural and good for us to have a CEO in chief, a dictator, a monarch, whatever it is that you want to call it, along with, of course, an accompanying aristocracy that will do as they will, while the rest of us will suffer what we must.
Those grinning oligarchs that were standing at the inauguration ceremony kind of come to mind. You've got the Bitcoin moguls that are extraordinarily excited about having federal backing for their Ponzi schemes, and we're sort of watching so much of it in real time. And I think back to that interview there with Vance in 2021, which is shocking that it was that long ago.
Oh, yeah.
They asked him, if there's a problem with the legislative branch, then what are the
time moves quick when the world is falling apart, right?
True. And he's basically like, oh, no worries. We'll just, there's this great guy named Yarvin, and he's got the answers to this. And it's so interesting because in an NYT, a New York Times interview with Ezra Klein recently, he was asked about democracy, and Yarvin was asked about, does J.D. Vance support democracy? And he's like, well, the little bit that I know about J.D. Vance. And I was like, oh, come on, buddy. And then he's like, well, we'll see how it shakes out. And he also said, I don't have a lot to do with this administration. And then it came out a week later that Curtis Yarvin had been directly advising the administration and was invited to the inauguration. So I guess, masks came off pretty quickly. But I wanted to show you here some of the executive orders that we have coming down the pike, because there's an element to Yarvin's his recommendations, his sort of goals for this monarchy that's very interesting and also detrimental. And that is to erase, it's very similar to Project 2025. And I think that's where the two align. And that is not only the misogynistic, very patriarchal elements that sort of diminishes women's rights and rights of minorities, but also the drilling down and removal of any kind of regulatory state whatsoever. So corporations can then essentially run our government as little fiefdoms, little kingdoms of their own. There's so many tech cities that are attempted to be built across the country. Not only from the extreme right wing. I just heard about a town in Tennessee where white nationalists have bought hundreds of acres of land and are trying to build their own exclusive community, to multiple cities in California where they're trying to build, and people like Balaji, Servi-San, and Mark Andreessen want to build, and folks from Y Combinator, which is another group that talks about expansion and having these communities that are essentially modern day script towns. And these executive orders essentially render any kind of regulatory state that we had null and void. And regulatory states are typically set, regulations are typically set, not all of them, but many, in legislation that is passed by the House and the Senate. So in a way, it is an erosion of any kind of regulatory state, so that these tech moguls, these giants, we're creating a modern Gilded Age, a modern robber baron society. And that does go into part of Yarvin's vision. His vision was, what did he say about poor people? That we could either use them as food and initially, and then he later joked that they could just be hooked up to AI and we'll use them as an energy source, like the Matrix or something.
Yeah, exactly. So really, he wants to create the machine empire, and all the rest of us are the ones who are going to go to sleep. He's been very overt about his aspirations recently for how the state's supposed to look like. And you can definitely see dimensions of that and what's going on. And I don't think a lot of this flows directly from his keyboard, as it were. These are kind of aspirations that many on the right have had for a long time. But it helps to think through it through Yarvin's, I don't want to call it philosophy, his worldview, right? So Yarvin has often said, and especially now, that what he wants is a so-called small state, but a very, very strong state. And these two things can seem in contrast or even contradictory to one another, but actually in his mind, they're not. And there's some truth to that, because what he really wants is a very, very strong state that is not going to be democratic, is not going to be accountable to anyone, is going to be very, very much governed from the top, and be able to do whatever is necessary in order to preserve this hierarchical structure, and of course protect the interests of the elites who are at the top. But at the same time, it is not going to be proactive in servicing the needs of ordinary people. It's going to more or less allow the ruling elite to do as they wish. And this has been a long-term aspiration of many, both on the libertarian right and on the autocratic right. You mentioned people like Peter Thiel, right? He's floated ideas of basically creating miniature cities governed by people like him, of course, out on the oceans, beyond the purview of government. And there'll be no welfare. There'll be no kind of succor offered to ordinary people. There'll definitely be no regulations on what it is that he wants to do. And this flows from a worldview that is centrally committed to the idea that, as Yarvin put it once, the masses suck, and everything that they have, they owe to those who are better than them, which is a quote from another important source or influence on Yarvin, Ludwig von Mises, who himself is widely associated with right libertarianism. And once you recognize that they think that the masses just generally suck, and anything that they have, they should be grateful for, and that's it, you'll understand why they want a very strong state that's not going to be responsive to their interests, but a small state that's also not going to interfere with their agency. And they'll be allowed to more or less do whatever they want and get away like bandits.
And the irony that we are seeing right now is that we know this as workers. We know it's true that they could not be self-sufficient without our dollar and without our labor. Yeah. It's just not, they're not going to sustain without that. Who are they going to have? They can eventually maybe get to having AI and robots do the majority of work for them, but they're still going to need human beings to a certain extent for a lot of labor that's necessary. But we are watching this in real time as we are watching Elon Musk's business tank. Tesla is tanking in part because of boycotts, yes.
And by the way, I'd just like to say to your audience, it is very good that Tesla is tanking right now, but we can do better, right? Definitely can do better to make sure that it goes under.
True. And, I just read about a massive recall because all the computers are failing. So I guess this philosophy of having regular working people work 120 hours a week, not paying your scientists, not paying your developers, pushing people to get this stuff out in quote unquote record time without regulations and oversight is a failed experiment, and it's failing fast. And that's the little bit of confidence that I do have, is that the more they push this, the worse it's going to get. And we saw this in the Gilded Age, and we saw this toward the end of the 20s when infrastructure and other things had began to collapse because of, overreach, abusing workers, improper development. I mean, we got the whole damn Dust Bowl out of it. It wasn't just a drought. It was because of over farming without responsibility. That's why we created the USDA in the first place. We starved half the country, and guess what? Those pain points not only impacted the poorest among us, but the most wealthy as well. So I want to read a quote that you had from your article. And again, this article was in, if you guys want to go check it out, it was in Commonwealth Magazine, and it was published January 27th, 2003. Yarvin's Case Against Democracy. Curtis Yarvin is too elitist for fascism. I think that's funny. Yarvin likes to present himself as an intellectual dissent swimming heroically against the tide of democratic modernity. Yarvin's writing is also very low intellectual quality, even compared with other reactionaries like Paul Gottfried or Alexander Dugin. I think those are great. Those are great references. He comes across as a kind of third-rate authoritarian David Foster Wallace, combining postmodern bookish eclecticism with a yearning to communicate with and influence disaffected white men. His writings are full of dubious historical claims, usually mixed with thinly veiled bigotry and a powdery kind of middle-class snobbery. So, taking away from your writing, and I'd love for you to expand on that some, but one of the things that I kept reminding myself when I was listening to Yarvin, as scary as what we see coming down the pike, a little bit of confidence I have is with how uniquely stupid it is. Mm-hmm. And I'm just being blunt. I was reading, there were so many logical holes in his diatribes. It was uniquely stupid, and he has been an elitist, and he runs in elite circles. I think potentially their nature of being so out of touch will be their downfall. And so if you want to expand on any of that, I don't have a specific question. I would just love to hear your thoughts.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. Right. I mean, a lot of what he writes is extraordinarily silly. I mean, some of it's self-consciously so, the stuff about dark elves and high elves and stuff. But when it's unconsciously silly that it really becomes, I don't even say charming, almost quaint is the right way to put it. I remember reading a piece of his from back in the 2000s, maybe it was the early 2010s, where he was talking about visiting Naples, which is a lovely city in southern Italy. I've been, parts of it are quite dangerous, to be clear. There's the mob there, and like any other big city, there's dangerous areas. But he talks about just being so afraid by the volume of crime he associated with Naples that he really wanted an authoritarian government to step in to put a stop to it, so he would feel safe. And the only thing I could think of is, God, must you be the shittiest person to vacation with, right? You go to a country outside of your safe zone. It's a developed state where thousands of people go every year, and you're just too damn afraid to go get a Neapolitan pizza because look at all the scary, not quite white, but maybe white people around you, right? So some of it is just very kind of powdery, bourgeois, quite frankly, chicken shit, kind of scared, attitudes that's just so easy to laugh at. But in terms of the kind of broader substance of his work, I think there are 2 points that I want to make here. First off, this idea that the cathedral, or as Lomas puts it, the longhouse or whatever, is some kind of progressive form of hegemony that basically distorts the capacity of ordinary people to realize that they want a monarch is a ridiculous idea, right? I'm enough of an old leftist to say, really, if the multi-billionaire class are the ones that are funneling money to you in order to propagate a message, which basically says that as rich and powerful as they are, the best thing for society is for them to be even more rich and powerful. I think you need to realize that you're the one who's engaged in a hegemonic activity, trying to reinforce the powers that be. And I mean, we've been moving towards a gilded age for a very long time. Government was very much in the middle of that in 2009 and 2008, after the government bailed out the wealthiest people in the world to the tune of hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars. And they still thought that was going too far, because at least a little bit of that money went to the lower orders. And of course, it was accompanied by calls for reform that amounted to nothing. So that's one point. The second point is there's this extraordinary disdain for democracy that's never sustained in any kind of intellectually cogent way. And a large part of it is the result of, again, this worldview that, to quote Von Mises again in his letter to Ayn Rand, the masses suck and they owe everything that is good in their life to those that are better than them, and towards whom they should show nothing but gratitude and servility. Well, the reality is that the advance of democracy has been an enormous catalyst for the improvement of human life around the globe. And I'll just give two quick examples of this. Right, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen has pointed out that the major reason why human beings have been able to avoid famine over the course of the latter half of the 20th century isn't just because we're better at producing food. We've been pretty good at producing food for a while. But because of the spread of democracy, precisely because democratic governments are far more responsive to the needs of their people, and allowing millions of people who might vote for you to starve is a pretty bad electoral decision to make. And so there's a very tight correlation between the provision of basic resources to the world's poorest and the adoption of a democratic form of government. Or just to give another example, right? Many people see democracy as a kind of banal thing, say, well, you don't really have any kind of impact through your vote. Why even bother? Well, there's a reason why it is that the civil rights movement, the suffragette movement, all advocated for the right to vote as the first right that was foundational in agitating for more rights. And that's because democracy is not just participating in a decision-making procedure. It's actually giving you a kind of power and voice as a collective. Now, that might not be much power individually, but as a group, it allows you to have a say in how things are organized. It allows women to have a say, for example, on things like their reproductive destiny, on things like women's health, on things like access, in a better country certainly than this, to maternal leave, right? And to actually have the capacity to make those kinds of demands efficacious by saying, if you don't deliver on this, then we're going to vote you out. Now, there are a lot of respects in which contemporary democracy is imperfect, and certainly imperfect in distributing power. And if I had my way, society would be much more democratic than it is right now. For instance, by extending democracy into the workplace, where I think it's long belonged and has rarely trod. But we should not draw the conclusion that just because we live in an imperfect democracy with a lot of flaws, that the problem lies with democracy. If anything, the problem lies with the fact, as Martin Gilens and Thomas Piketty and too many social scientists have pointed out, that we still live in a society where the elites, by and large, get their way on most issues, and certainly have increasing form since the 1980s, when we started to see cascading inequality rise again. And many people are just sick of it because they think that government does not actually represent their interests or advance causes that are vital for the needs of ordinary people. And we need to do everything that we can to correct for that as quickly as possible.
Yeah, completely. I think that even as imperfect as it is, an authoritarian state, as we are witnessing, is absolutely not the answer. No. And that sort of brings me to, I'm starting to see this whole idea of deregulation. I'm seeing this idea of sort of the elites running the government almost like a business, now branching into, and of course it's always been part of the Democratic Party. There's been dark money, corporate money in the Democratic Party forever. They are other presidents, Obama, Clinton, they've all had multi-million, centimillionaires and billionaires in their cabinet. Let's not say they haven't, but I'm also not going to pretend like we are not on an accelerated path right now where things are hitting us near daily compared to where we were before. It was already problematic, and now we are in sort of a set fire to everything mode, right? But under this whole thing happening, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, journalists Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, have written a book called Abundance. Mm-hmm. And in their book, it's sort of their remedy for where we are right now. And specifically, they focus on the housing crisis with sort of a faux YIMBY. And YIMBY is yes in my backyard, but there is a faux YIMBY movement. Yes in my backyard says, let's roll back regulations some. Let's roll back restrictions some so that we can build, especially in wealthy areas, so that there's more housing. It's a great concept on its face. However, it was taken over by massive real estate and development conglomerates poured a ton of money into this. And what ended up happening is it ended up getting co-opted by them. Mm-hmm. And so now it's pushes toward gentrification, pushing out the poor, mm-hmm. Let's free up federal lands. Let's free up reservations. And Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson are kind of along that vein of extreme deregulation. And eventually when things get better for the wealthy of us, it's going to trickle down on the poorest. And I want to just share a little excerpt from his book that Kate Willett had posted about 2 weeks ago. It says, out the window and across the street, an autonomous drone is dropping off the latest shipment of star pills. So this is how they're envisioning the future. Several years ago, daily medications that reduced overeating, cured addiction, and slowed cellular aging were considered miracle drugs for the rich, especially when we discovered that key molecules were best synthesized in zero gravity conditions of space. But these days, automatic factories thrum in low orbit. So his viewpoint is, you know, once we have complete deregulation, all of a sudden this is going to be available. These pills are going to be dropped at the doorsteps of people. Well, right now, insulin costs someone who needs it, a life-saving drug, only a couple dollars to manufacture, but then hundreds of dollars for an individual to buy. So without addressing regulation, I feel like without addressing cost, without addressing labor rights, without addressing the systemic and cultural issues, I feel like this is in part a regurgitated version of Yarvin. And I don't know if you've looked into this or what your thoughts are on sort of the neoliberal veneer of this type of deregulation visionism.
Sure. I mean, I have a few things to say about it. I'll break it into three. So first off, I haven't read Klein's book on abundance. I listened to a podcast that he did with Sean Elling, The Gray Area, and you know, some of the stuff I agreed with. Right. I do think that NIMBYism is a very bad thing, right? If you hold to progressive values and say we need more homeless shelters, we need more, places where people can get cheap medication, we need more things like cheap public transportation, you should say yes in my neighborhood, right? So that's all well and good. What I did disagree with is that all that we really need to do is enact these deregulatory technical fixes and mobilize political support for these kind of deregulatory technical fixes. And by and large, things will improve. And the reason why I don't agree with that is because, to your point, I think that fundamentally what this misunderstands is the nature of power in a contemporary capitalist society, bluntly, because it could very well be that in some circumstances, deregulation could benefit the least well off. To give an example, my friend Aaron Ross Powell, who's a left libertarian, likes to point out, there were some circumstances where monopolistic practices prevented, for instance, people from operating cabs in New York City, even when they were very poor and they had a card and they wanted to do so, right? Things like that we should probably get rid of. But if you don't actually democratize economic power and voice, inevitably deregulation is going to lead to exactly the kind of results that we were talking about earlier, where the rich have agency to do whatever it is that they wish, and ordinary people are just required to subordinate themselves to that. So I think there needs to be much more profound rethinking of these dynamics of power. And this leads me to the second thing that I think is important, which is that we need to recognize or to wean ourselves off of a lot of different cultural attitudes that are conducive to negative outcomes. And I'll just list two here. One is this argument that the very affluent produce jobs for the rest of us. Now, I'm not associating this with Klein, but I know a lot of neoliberals think this way. I hear this a dozen times a day. Elon Musk created thousands of jobs. Jeff Bezos created thousands of jobs, et cetera, et cetera. My argument is, why is it that we never say, those 1,000 people who worked for Elon Musk, they made him a billionaire, right? It's not the case that billionaires create jobs for thousands of people. Thousands of people work to create one billionaire. And the fact that our society is inhibited from recognizing it by these kinds of cultural idioms is a big part of the problem, right? Or to give another example, there's this long-standing misconstrual of the state as somehow contrary to the market or contrary to capitalism. Actually, as sociologists have pointed out for a very long time, the state has absolutely been essential, including in the US, for the propagation of market society, the propagation of capitalist mode of production, for extending property rights, indeed for creating property rights. And the reason we need to wean ourselves off of this vision is we need to recognize that it's really not a circumstance where anybody is arguing for the state to truly disappear, because the very wealthy don't want the state to disappear, especially people like Yarvin. What they want is the state to work for them in their interests. And once we grasp this, I think we'll have a better understanding of the actual political dynamics in which we're operating right now. And then I guess the third thing that I want to say is that I think that the problem with this idea of abundance and affluence and NIMBYism isn't that any of the specific arguments are bad. Again, I have some sympathy for some of them. It's that there's a lack of vision for a future that would fundamentally improve upon what we have right now. So I think a lot of the reason why people are deeply dissatisfied with liberals and neoliberals in particular is they associate it with the kind of politics you see the Democratic Party engaging in year in and year out. This idea that the way that you win elections is by finding different demographic groups that will support you, offering each of those demographic groups a little bag of goodies if they promise to vote for you, and then you stitch together.
Yeah,
exactly. And then you stitch together 52% of the people who are going to form your coalition. You bring them out on election day by mobilizing them by just constant text messages, and then you beat the other guy, right? Well, that is not a politics that is going to be particularly inspiring to anyone. It offers no vision for the future. It offers no philosophy of improvement, and it doesn't connect people to the kinds of transcendent values that I think many people want in their politics. Values like justice, value like human dignity, values like creating a fair society. And I think as long as Democrats just keep on reaching to these technocratic outlooks and suggesting that we don't need to offer people something more, they're always going to be vulnerable to the appeals of a right-wing populist who does have a vision for how the world should look. As a horrifying vision and one that disempowers ordinary people in the long run, but at least it's a worldview.
Yeah, at least it gives some people an out, like Yarvin always says, money isn't real power, culture is real power, which is a load of bullshit. I mean, there is some truth to the fact that culture is real power, but what that tells somebody who's maybe poor that follows him is, oh, MAGA is winning. That means we're winning culturally. That's what has real value as they lose more and more of their rights as human beings and more of their financial security. It's this feeling of winning, this feeling of, we're making it, when it's absolutely gaslighting. And that's what I feel like a lot of the, sort of Peter Thiel and David Sachs, the diversity myth, multiculturalism, political intolerance on campus, those kind of books, everything that focuses on sort of the anti-woke culture, the red-pilled culture, it is all a distraction from the fact that what Yarvin says, money isn't real power, or that it will eventually trickle down on us, that the real power is in, opening up the free market so that it can come back to us without any kind of real class analysis, which is something I feel like Ezra Klein's book was missing. And I feel like they were similar in the way that they're missing a class analysis. Now, on the contrary, I feel like Yarvin has a class analysis to a certain extent. It's just that he is in support of the elite class and has no room at all for anyone else. So kind of to end, I know that there's a lot of younger Gen Z, especially in, their 20s, early 20s. There's lots of guys in their 30s now, especially white men. It's mostly white men that are being pulled into this sort of rabbit hole, supporting this dystopia because they feel so disconnected from everything else. What is it that you would say to them as far as what would your message be to those individuals who are sort of getting sucked down this rabbit hole?
What I would say to ordinary people is that it is very right to be angry at politics. It is very right to be angry at the elite because there are people out there who do not have the interest of ordinary people in mind and who are deeply entrenched and deeply committed to ensuring that they acquire more power, more status, and more wealth for themselves. It is deeply wrong, however, to blame people who are worse off than yourself because it is a lot easier to do that rather than actually confront the real forces that are dominating us at the moment. I think that in the long run, the only way to actually overcome resentments at elitism and to overcome the feelings of subordination that many of us have is to have a society where there aren't as many elites as there are right now, where the kinds of subordination that are so pervasive in our life are actually eliminated, not just for white men, although that's part of it, but for everyone, if at all possible. And we know that there are alternatives out where this is possible. It's not a utopian vision. There are other countries in the world, like the Nordic states, for example, that are amongst the most flourishing societies that humankind has ever created, that have the world's highest quality of life, that are more democratic and more free than right now. And that is in large part a consequence of their commitment to things like economic equality, and of course, a consequence of their commitment to things like gender equality as well, especially if you look at countries like, say, Iceland, for example. That's been really at the forefront of this. So rather than be afraid of democracy and afraid of equality and afraid of economic redistribution or economic democracy, as I prefer to call it, we should see that as the solution to a lot of these feelings. And if you don't believe me, just look at what the very wealthy people in society are actually saying. They're saying that that's actually not the solution. And that's because it's in their interest to make sure that no one wakes up to the fact that that is the way that we should go moving forward.
True. And, we'll close out, but I'll just add to that we're seeing it right now. It's Yarvin's theory. He calls it rage. Remove all government employees. And we're now seeing that means your neighbor that works down the street at the National Park Service, which you like to go to fish or hunt or to do whatever you want to do, to go kayaking in the summer. Well, now those employees are gone and you don't get to take advantage of that. We learned that diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, included people with disabilities and included veterans. And now nearly 100,000 veterans have been fired. It included the VA. It included many things that we take for granted. The United States Postal Service. So many of you guys need that. You don't want to see the Postal Service go away. And guess what? That extra $500 you're going to get, that $5,000 check, that's not coming. But the cost of losing all of these services are going to impact you now. So in very real time, we can see the fallacies of their arguments happening every single day.
And I'll just add one more. This is my Annie Bernie Sanders speaking. They just promised potentially $800 billion worth of cuts to public health care. These are vital systems that mothers, children, the very poorest in society rely upon, not just to stay healthy, but to stay alive. And you have to ask yourself, if you need any more evidence, what kind of people would think that is the right thing to do, especially when the people who are running the government, like Elon Musk, are sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars and could very easily decide to take a cut from that in order to sustain these programs, but they'd rather the poor eat cake instead.
Yeah, and 90% of you, your parents, your grandparents, are going to have to rely on Medicaid at some point if they become elderly to help them out with cost. It's just how it is in our society because costs are way too much. We rely on that system. And what's going to happen when that's not there for them? How are you going to care for your loved ones?
Absolutely. And I think it's absolutely atrocious that veterans can't walk into a hospital and get exactly the kind of care that they need. And I also think that's atrocious that children would walk into a hospital and not be able to get the care that they need without their parents having to go into debt to provide it for them. And this isn't, again, something that's a utopian idea. There are decent and even middle-income societies around the world that do this. This is the richest country in the world, indeed the history of the world.
And one of the only that doesn't offer some sort of public universal healthcare system. One of the only developed countries in the entire world.
Exactly, right? And studies after studies have shown that this has led to health outcomes being enormously expensive and outcomes being very bad for ordinary people. And the only ones who really benefit from this are the extremely affluent who are either not concerned about health outcomes for themselves or their health outcomes for themselves or their families at all, or they directly benefit from keeping the system the way that it is. So it is long past time for a change on that.
Absolutely. So instead of going backwards to a kingship, I think we're going to find out in the next few months just how stupid Yarvin's philosophies are. Hopefully we'll be spit back out into the right direction, but that takes people speaking up. Speaking of which, thank you so much, Matt, for coming on and sharing your expertise and your history on this with us today, and kind of explaining in a broader view what kind of impacts this has and a little bit of history of who this guy is. I really appreciate it, and I thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you very much. And if any of your audience want to get in touch with me, just feel free to shoot me an email or something. I'm happy to chat.
And do you have any projects or anything that you would want to share?
Oh, sure. I'm working on a new book right now on a philosopher called G.A. Cohen, my good friend Ben Burgess. And I've got a couple of new articles coming up for places like Jacobin Magazine and Commonwealth also. So if people want to check those out, just keep an eye on. I'm sure they'll be around.
And that reminds me, there was a great debate between Yarvin and Ben Burgess that's a couple years old, but would be fascinating to watch.
Yeah, Ben's a good friend of mine. If you're not subscribed to his channel, shameless plug, you should subscribe to it. Give them an argument. He's got lots of great content. And if you're interested in fiery debates with people like Yarvin, he's the place to go to right now. That's for sure.
Well, thanks again so much, Matt, and I appreciate your time. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Level low.